Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to this post-summit briefing and EPC update, our regular look at the key developments in and around the European Union. My name is Jacki Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the EPC, and with me this week, as always, is Janis Emmanouilidis, Director of Studies at the EPC. And contrary to the titles, unfortunately, Fabian Zulig couldn't be with us today. He'll be back for the next briefing, but we have two wonderful special guests. Delighted to welcome back Amanda Paul, Senior Policy Analyst in the EPC's Europe in the World programme, and lovely to have with us again Corina Stratulat, Head of the EPC's European Politics and Institute programme and Senior Policy Analyst. In this special edition of Update, where we'll be discussing the outcome of the EU summit, it's just finished within the last 30 minutes and the press conferences are just beginning, but we will endeavour to bring you our analysis of what EU leaders have been talking about, what they've agreed and what it means as we look at next steps on Ukraine, on enlargement, on the economy and on the future of Europe. As always, totally interactive, questions from me to our panel, and I hope from all of you. Click on the raised hands button if you wish to speak, and I will activate your mic at the relevant time, or use the Q&A box, not the chat, the Q&A, and please be very brief. Janis, just give us a sense before we delve into some of the detail. There was a lot on the table at this summit. Some of it they talked in depth, some of it they didn't talk so much about. What were the main issues and what did they focus on most?
Well, I think if you look into yesterday and today, what ties both days together, today was largely about the economy, is the war in Ukraine and the consequences of it. So when they were discussing the economy, they were addressing issues related to the energy crisis, the food prices, so things which are very much linked to Ukraine. And yesterday was the bigger day, the more significant day, when decisions were taken with respect to the candidate status of Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, and also enlargement in general. So yesterday were the big news. Today it was less, but we will be talking about all this in the upcoming hour.
And the decisions, though, were in those key issues of yesterday. Today was more conversations, orientations, as I understand it. Is that right?
Well, they took some decisions there. There are also some changes to the comparing the draft conclusions to the final conclusions. But yes, yesterday was major decision day. Some even called it historic, but we'll see.
Indeed, they called it historic. That was Charles Michel. Ursula von der Leyen called it a very defining moment, and Macron said we had taken giant steps. So, Amanda, let us come to that question of, first of all, there were several discussions on enlargement, but let's focus first on the big one, on Ukraine, Moldova and Georgia. Was the final decision in line precisely with what the Commission had recommended, or were there any changes, any extra conditions attached? Because you wrote a commentary this week with your colleague, Ricardo Borges de Castro, insisting that candidate status for Ukraine was, and I quote, a geopolitical and moral imperative and must be granted without conditions. Did they listen to you?
Yeah, I would say they absolutely did. I have to say, I still find it quite surreal that Ukraine and Moldova are now candidate countries. Yes, having worked on this topic for many years, I just find my heart expressing this pure happiness that they've actually made that. And there was no conditions added, which was brilliant, because there was question marks whether there would be, preconditions to becoming a candidate country, which would have been ridiculous. So I think it was the right thing to do. So now they're candidates. Now we enter another stage in their relationship with the EU. Lots of work ahead, but I don't doubt that both Ukraine and Moldova will really have the impetus and the readiness to really get down and do it.
And you talked about your heart beating. There was a marvelous picture of the Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine weeping visibly in her office when she heard the news, which was, I think, many people found very moving. In terms of what happens next, we've had a lot of caution, and there was a lot of criticism of Emmanuel Macron yesterday for, some said, sending mixed messages about what this decision meant. But he certainly said, it's a long road to travel, and we'll come back to it in a moment, but he said, that's why I want to talk also about this other concept of a European political community. As I say, park that for a moment. But the Belgian Prime Minister among those who said, it's going to be a long, long way with huge reforms that will take time. That leads some people, Amanda, to say, well, this is a symbolic decision. It's not really going to make a huge difference. They're still going to wait a very long time. Are they right? Or is that jump to candidate statements, is it making your heart beat faster because it is really significant?
I mean, I think it is a significant decision. I mean, obviously, it's not going to be 2 or 3 years before they accede to the EU. But I think, I mean, Ukraine's situation is obviously complicated by the fact there's an ongoing war. It's not sure how this is going to end, when it's going to end. But the way I look at it, as I said, I've been working on Ukraine and Moldova for a long time. Both of these countries have been implementing association agreements and deep and comprehensive trade agreements with the EU since a few years. And if you look at the criteria in both of these agreements, they're almost identical to what countries who are already acceding to the EU, who are involved in accession talks, are implementing themselves. And Ukraine, for example, has already done about 70%. So I don't doubt the ability of both countries to actually move ahead quite rapidly. I mean, there are challenges. I mean, Ukraine, in terms of, the rule of law, anti-corruption, these are things that have always been problematic in the past, but definitely not as problematic as they were a few years ago. And the other thing that both countries have is very, very strong civil society. And civil society, I mean, in Ukraine, it's active at a local level, a national level, at a regional level, and they've been like a stick on the back of the Ukrainian government and presidency for many years. They have set the political agenda in the past. They did it in 2014 after Maidan. They've come up with roadmaps, and they're very dynamic and very, productive. So I think the fact that Ukraine and Moldova have these very strong civil societies is going to be actually crucial as well in moving forward. I mean, Moldova is in a situation where it can go quicker than Ukraine. Also, the parliament, the presidency, and the government in Moldova are all aligned now. They're all pro-EU, pro-West, and this will make a big difference.
Just, I know you want to come in, Corina, but just, Amanda, 2 words on Georgia.
I mean, Georgia, I'm sorry to say, they only have their self to blame. For the last 1 year, there has been a stagnation in the reform process. In Georgia, there's been polarization among political parties. There's been infighting. The opposition blames everything on the government blames everything on the opposition. The so-called Michel agreement that was supposed to resolve this political polarization 1 year ago, collapsed due to both parties. So this left Georgia in quite a weak situation. So I really hope that the Georgian government and opposition learn that they need to sit down and they need to work together. They're both on the same side, not on opposing sides, at least not when it comes to this issue. And they actually listen to what's been told to them and meet the criteria that's been put down to become a candidate country, hopefully by the end of this year, because it's up to them. Nobody else can help them. It's up to Georgian politicians and MPs to do what needs to be done, because they are failing their population. I mean, a couple of days ago, there was tens of thousands of people on the street in Tbilisi saying, we want to be members of the EU. We want to be candidate country. You need to do it to their politicians.
Thank you very much. Corina, I know you wanted to react on that, and then I want to ask you a question about the Western Balkans, but you wanted to react to something Amanda said.
Sure, thank you, Jackie. Well, just for the sake of the discussion, of the debate, I will agree with Amanda that this decision is a significant gesture. I could even liken it to a memorable love declaration, but love doesn't necessarily lead to marriage, even when the lovers are genuinely committed to uniting their destinies. And in this case, I would say that there are reasons to doubt that the EU is actually serious about enlargement, or that indeed it is able to contemplate expansion in the current form, even if it wanted to. Now, at least out of moral duty, the EU probably had to respond the way that it did to these countries, but this hugely symbolic nod has real life implications, and I'm not entirely sure that the consequences have been properly thought through. The EU accession process is hugely transformative, not only for the aspiring countries reforming to meet EU standards, but also for the Union itself, whose balance of power in decision making, for example, stands to shift quite dramatically if new members join the club. Will the EU assume this transformation, given that it will probably entail major changes to the treaties? Also, how will the new step now influence the EU's efforts to restore peace on the continent, and how will it influence its position vis-a-vis Russia in the long term? The bottom line is that this gesture doesn't seem to be embedded, for me, in a credible vision for the future of EU's engagement with family members and also with other neighbors.
We'll come back on that, because I want to talk about the European political community and whether that would provide that vision. But let's first, the other news angle, if you like, from the summit. And right. Amidst all the celebrations for Ukraine and Moldova, before the summit began, anger, fury, indeed, at the meeting with Western Balkan leaders. There were accusations afterwards of, and I quote, a serious blow to the EU's credibility, references to the crooked spirit of enlargement. I mean, the language flying around was pretty torrid. What was the purpose of that meeting? And what was the outcome? Why was it so bitter and angry?
Right. Well, I mean, another interesting observation about the decision to grant candidate status to Ukraine and the Republic of Moldova, and I think one of you brought it up already, is that leaders actually had the audacity to remind everyone that the Eastern countries will have to do some seriously heavy lifting now to meet the conditions for starting negotiations with the EU, and that, you know, just in case anyone was worried about premature accessions, that enlargement is a merit-based process. I mean, a surreal discourse if you consider that at the very same time and on the very same day, the Balkan countries were prevented from advancing towards the EU, not so much because of their track record of reforms, but rather because member states have hijacked the enlargement policy yet again. So EU leaders were set to address this, the accession path of the Balkan countries in the summit that preceded the European Council meeting. And the only thing that was achieved, to respond to your question, is basically sweeping disappointment. Still no start of accession talks for North Macedonia and Albania, still no visa liberalization for Kosovo, and still no candidate status for Bosnia and Herzegovina. But of course, to be sure, efforts were made to try to break, for example, the impasse in the dispute between Bulgaria and North Macedonia over issues of history, identity, and language. For example, to indulge Sofia to lift the veto on Skopje, the French presidency made a proposal which basically foresees the inclusion of some conditions, well, let's call them bilateral tools, in the EU's negotiating framework for North Macedonia. And the Bulgarian parliament apparently lifted the veto today, quite overwhelmingly so, in the parliament, based on this French proposal, but also with some further demands added. So the ball is now in the court of North Macedonia, which, for what's worth it, has already indicated that it won't accept this proposal, among others, because it means that North Macedonia will have to amend its constitution to anchor the rights of Bulgarian minority in the country, and also more generally because it could make it that much easier for Bulgaria to block Skopje down the line again on similar grounds.
Thank you. We'll come back on that issue you raised about the EU's own capacity, its ability to contemplate expansion, because the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz indeed referred to, we need to make ourselves capable of enlargement, and we need to take the conclusions talk about taking into consideration the EU's capacity to absorb new members. But I want to come back to that later in the context of the, I was going to say discussion, but I think the word would probably be non-discussion on the Conference on the Future of Europe, but we'll come back to that. Janis, Amanda's heart is beating faster. Corina's dismayed really by what she sees, and a lack, I think, of a feeling of a genuine commitment, certainly to the countries of the Western Balkan. What is your reading? What is the balance of the degree to which this was a hugely historic positive development, or it was more of a symbolic gesture?
This was a European Council meeting, so it's usual that you have both things being correct at the same time. I can understand why Amanda is happy, and I fully subscribe to her happiness, and I think it was the right thing to do, but I also am aware, and I know that Amanda is aware of that too, of Corina's realism. So both is true, and we are sending mixed signals. But I think the important thing is, that's where I've tried to make a step back, is how we got to the point where, given the situation we're witnessing since the 24th of February, that we have found ourselves in a position where now the candidate status is being granted. And 3, 4, 6 months ago, who would have thought that this would ever be possible? So this is major, and it is symbolic, but symbolism in these times matter a lot. They're not symbolic in the sense of meaning nothing. They're symbolic of giving a signal, and they're giving a signal to take the picture which Corina was using to a third party who's not part of that love couple and potential marriage, who wants to interfere with that couple and wants to play a role of getting them not to be able to decide themselves whether they want to get together or not. So we're sending a very strong signal towards Moscow, towards Putin. And if we would not have done so, I think the signal would have been very negative. And the second point is what we have understood yesterday and what we understand today, and I'm not sure whether we will continue to understand this 6 months down the line, a year or 2 years down the line, is that there is a geopolitical imperative to think differently about enlargement, about the accession of other countries to the European Union. And we're going to come back to the necessity of us having to reform ourselves in order to be able to do that. But this has become, again, a geopolitical imperative. So we live in a different world compared to where we were some months ago. The question is, will we understand this also in the long term and do whatever it takes in order to be able to live up to the expectations which we're now raising?
Do you see signs that EU leaders, from this discussion and discussions in the run-up to the summit, that they are waking up to that or not?
Yes, they are waking up, and they have understood, and they have granted and taken the decision, which, again, 3 months ago, most people would have thought was not possible. But having understood it and talking about Zeitenwende, the new era, watershed, and then doing what is necessary in order to be able to live up to that rhetoric are two different things.
Thank you. Amanda, a reaction to that, if you would. And also Stefan Schreck asks, is there something the EU could do to help candidate countries to adapt more quickly to EU standards beyond the traditional support measures? So when we say, and someone said, it'll take at least a decade, and you indicated, actually, no, there are reasons for hope that it could go faster. Is there more the EU could be doing, do you think?
I mean, I agree with what Janis just said. I mean, this was a very important geopolitical message from the side of the EU, because we need to get rid of, what I would call grey zones or buffer zones, which is what basically some people, including, the guy sitting in the Kremlin, viewed Moldova and Ukraine among other countries. So I think this sends a strong message, and it's important for both of these countries that there was some sort of clarity over the relationship, their long-term relationship with the EU, where it's going, what direction. So I do support what he said.
And can the EU do more?
I mean, the EU can always do more. In terms of the process, I mean, something that's been talked about a lot over the last months is this issue of phased membership or different steps of membership, where instead of waiting till the end of a very, very long process, years and years to get something, you would get it in steps, and enter the single market when you're ready to. Or other sort of issues along those lines, which makes the process, I would think, maybe easier, much easier in a way, in terms of for the country that's negotiating, but also perhaps for the EU. So it's more of a step-by-step process rather than waiting 2 decades, which I do believe would be the right way to go.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let us move on to Emmanuel Macron's comment when he said the reason he was proposing a European political community was because it was such a long road to travel. The summit conclusions in their reference to the political community, unless they changed, I saw a draft version, said, quotes, it would not replace existing EU policies and instruments, notably enlargement. So trying to reassure, no, we're not saying this is instead of, we're saying this is as well as, but some people raising eyebrows saying, you're suggesting, Mr. French President, that something we haven't even created is going to be a faster route to getting closer to the EU than a process that already exists. Corina, you said there's no credible vision for the relationship with future family members, non-family members. Does this not offer a vision? And what do we know about the reaction to it from EU leaders?
Well, I mean, the different proposals, ideas that have surfaced recently, including Macron's political community, remain for me ambiguous, not only on about the details of what they actually propose, but also the ultimate goal or what they seek to achieve. Are they meant to rethink the accession process or enlargement policy, or are they offering alternatives to EU membership? As mentioned earlier, we do need a more credible vision of engagement with our neighbors than currently is the case, but the implications of that and the links of any new grand design with the ongoing enlargement should be carefully considered. Macron's political community, for example, seems to relegate the Western Balkans to an outer circle, together with now Georgia, the Republic of Moldova, Ukraine, possibly UK. And from there, they could enjoy some benefits of integration, for example, into the single market or access to EU budget, but no decision-making power, not until those countries who are pursuing accession would actually get in. The risk of this strategy for me is that it does little to incentivize reform in fundamental areas like democracy, economic governance, or foreign policy, which the EU holds very dear. So the Balkans and now the new candidates could be stuck in this waiting room or in this outer circle indefinitely. Is that desirable? Is that the goal? It might be a more honest approach in that it better reflects what is feasible at present. But given the EU's commitment and ambition behind enlargement policy for the countries that are concerned, of course, it might prove a counterproductive strategy. Having said that, it is positive, I think, that these conversations are happening. I mean, enlargement policy itself needs rethinking. As our conversation so far indicates, in many ways, enlargement policy seems to be kind of on the deathbed, with the Commission desperately trying to provide life support, artificial ventilation, and then some member states proposing experimental medication. Ultimately, no reform is ever likely to substitute for the member states' lack of political will to open the door to new members. And I think that has to be clarified first and foremost. And beyond that, of course, the merits of the 2020 new approach to enlargement is yet to be tested out. Then any new procedures should also consider or should also reflect on effective solutions to very thorny issues, like the normalization of relations between Belgrade and Pristina, like the situation and impasse in Bosnia and Herzegovina, or the persistence of autocratic tendencies in the region. This should be the focus of any potential upgrades to the policy. And of course, finally, the Union, I think, should prepare its absorption capacity if any new accessions are to ensure that further widening can continue to go hand in hand with further deepening.
Let me ask you to hold that thought until we come to the conference on the future of Europe. But Amanda, I'll get your reaction to whether you think this is a runner or not. You were pretty skeptical about it at our last update, I remember. But Janis, do we know what the EU leaders said about it? Was there any form of real conclusions on this? Was there any concrete outcome to that discussion?
Well, we have the conclusions of the European Council, which didn't change, by the way, but they are very vague. They don't really give a clear impression and even a clear idea of what the European political community would look like. By the way, they should have asked us before they call it EPC. They should have also looked into the history books of European integration, because we've had attempt to create a European political community, which looked very different in the 50s, and it was about something else. So the name in itself, I think, is critical. But there is this idea that it will take off the ground. Michel, in the press conference just before we started, indicated that there might be a first meeting during the Czech presidency. So there is an inclination to push it forward, but we don't know the details. We are aware that some believe that actually it is not something which is an add-on on the way to full membership, but rather think of it as a potential alternative. And that's also put ourselves into a position of what the situation will look like in 2, 3, 4 or 5 years, where there might be less pressure in order to get countries into the European Union, and then the voices of those who might see this as an alternative might become stronger. And it shouldn't be an alternative. It should be something which, from now to the moment where some, on the basis of their merits and their ability to join, will be joining the European Union. But as long as you see it as an alternative, it's problematic. And second,
but if it's also got countries like the UK in, it's not for countries who are going to be joining the European Union.
It's a much bigger configuration. And if you look into the Council conclusion, at the end it says, fully respect the European Union's decision-making autonomy. And I remember having had discussions about other forms of aligning countries to the European Union on the way to membership, where there were always two reasons which were mentioned against it. One was money, and the other one was interference with the EU business, with the inside EU business. So here you have a reference in the conclusion saying, respect the European Union's decision-making autonomy. That already is showing the limits which you're putting on this kind of endeavor. And if it actually is to make a difference, you don't start with the limits, but you start by the defining of actually what you want to achieve with it. And there is a difference among the 27, definitely, on that.
Amanda, as I say, I recall you being rather skeptical about this idea when we last talked about it. We know a little bit more about what they're talking about. There are competing versions of it out there. There's going to be an EPC event looking at the different versions next week. Your assessment of it now, are you still skeptical? And do you think countries knocking at the EU's door can be convinced this isn't anything but a way to make it an alternative?
Well, I'm looking forward to the EPC event next week, simply because I might actually learn something about this thing, because as both, Corina and Janis have already expressed, I mean, there isn't very much known about it at all. So I think we'll have to wait and see. But I mean, the Ukrainians have already said, thanks, but no thanks, we're not interested. And to be honest, I mean, I'm not sure that Monsieur Macron really thought it through himself when he came up with the idea. And it's certainly not the first time the French have come up with an idea without having very much meat on the bones, or they have proposed something that's had no added value. For example, the Union for the Mediterranean, that was supposed to be this absolutely huge new initiative that had a massive, you might remember that, Jacki, jamboree. And then we barely hear a word about it. And it's not the other initiative, privileged partnership, that was put on the table to Turkey as well years ago. So I'll wait and see, but I'm rather skeptical. I think it may be something that will just fizzle out, and that probably would be a good thing.
Thank you. You mentioned Turkey before I let you go. I just wondered if you could enlighten us on the reference in the council conclusions, and I'm reading them, express deep concern about recent actions and statements by Turkey, called on Ankara to, quote, respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all EU member states, and said the European Council expects Turkey to de-escalate tensions. Talking, of course, about tensions between Greece and Turkey. What was that all about? You're muted, my dear. I think probably because it's such a huge question and we're trying to tackle it in a second.
Yeah, I'm trying to avoid speaking about Turkey. No. Yeah, I mean, things in the Aegean have been really hotting up since April. I wouldn't say this is all about Turkey, frankly. It's also about Greece. We need to remember that, Erdogan and Mitsotakis are facing elections next year. So this is also an element, and it's playing into this, very worrying situation. I mean, yes, what Turkey is doing is not helpful, but as I said, it's not all down to Turkey, and I think both sides really need to take steps to de-escalate. And this was a message that was given, I mean, today or yesterday by the Secretary General of NATO. I mean, NATO is able to ask both sides to de-escalate, both sides in the same club. The EU is only ever able to tell Turkey to de-escalate. So yeah, they need to de-escalate, and we need to knock their heads together. I mean, come on now, enough is enough.
On that note, Amanda, I know you can't stay with us for the whole session, but thank you so much for joining us again. It's always a joy to have you with us. Yeah, you wanted to add
I just wanted to add one more thing, because
Please.
I didn't have a chance to say it. I just want to come back to Ukraine,
Yep.
and just to remind everybody that in the euphoria of candidate country status, the thing that Ukraine needs the most still is heavy arms, artillery. Ukraine has a border of more than 1,000 kilometers. They need artillery, and they need much more. So
And
everyone out there listening, please think about that.
Thank you very much, Amanda. And I wanted to ask Janis, did they talk at all about other forms? They talk about support, military and otherwise, for Ukraine, but was it a substantive discussion? Did they talk about, I think they were talking about financial assistance. They're beginning to talk about reconstruction assistance, but was there a substantive conversation on military? And indeed, just to wrap them all into one, save a bit of time, on the export of grain, which of course has implications for Ukraine and its economy, but also for the world. Was there much conversation about these other issues relating to the war?
No, there was also an exchange about that, but if you look into the council conclusions, you will see that they don't go into very much detail. They're reiterating a lot of what we already knew about things which they have themselves said only some weeks ago when we had the informal summit. So in terms of concrete progress, there's not that much, but you can be sure that during the summit, but also at the margins of it, there have been exchanges about also the issues which now Amanda was raising with respect to how to further support Ukraine and what needs to be done, where some member states are still more hesitant than others. And at the end of the day, without the American support for Ukraine, the Ukrainians wouldn't be able to defend their country and sovereignty the way they're defending it. So we're very much dependent on someone else who's not sitting in the club of the EU 27. However, yes, they had exchanges. They're also in the conclusions, you find a reference to the food crisis, clearly saying that Russia is the one who is, and I'm quoting, solely responsible for the global food security crisis. And they call on Russia to stop targeting agricultural facilities, to unblock the Black Sea, especially the port of Odessa. So there's some concrete references on what the Russians should be doing. And they also express support for the so-called solidarity lanes to facilitate food exports from Ukraine to other parts of Europe and the world. So there is reference to that. The question is, will that actually help to fight the substantial food shortage problems we're having, and which we're having increasingly in countries, especially of the global south. So yes, there have been discussions, but is this enough? Probably not, and I'm sure that they will come back, and we'll have to come back to this.
Thank you very much. Just now linking that and the food crisis to the cost of living crisis and the discussion on the economy. Obviously, they were meeting against the backdrop of raging inflation, rising bond yields, a lot of things to be concerned about. They had with us the ECB president, Christine Lagarde, was there. What was the discussion focusing around? Did it take any concrete decisions? And are we clear? Is there going to be another summit on this? There was talk beforehand, Mario Draghi, backed by Emmanuel Macron, were talking about we need another summit. But I saw the Swedish Prime Minister saying, I don't want to come for another summit unless there's something really substantive to discuss. What did they discuss here? And are they going to meet again in July to talk about this?
Now, with respect to July, before we started our update, and summit briefing, I was watching the press conference, and von der Leyen was saying that she will present proposals related to the energy crisis to EU leaders in July. So for me, this was an indication that they would meet again. There has been strong pressures from a number of EU heads of state and government, especially from Mario Draghi, saying that there needs to be more of a discussion among the EU 27 when it comes to the economy / also energy, where the Italians together with the Greeks have been pushing for price caps on gas, which, by the way, there is a reference in the council conclusions to that. So they have scored with respect to that issue in a certain way. And also, let's not forget the fact that the energy situation will probably get worse before it gets better. There are increasing indications that there is a danger that energy cuts or gas cuts will increase from the side of Russia. The International Energy Agency warning of that. Some countries are preparing for it. Germany triggered the second stage of the National Gas Emergency Plan. And there is also pressure to coordinate of how to react if we get to that point, once we get to that point. Because if you don't have a reaction and a common reaction, that could be a major source of division among the EU 27. So there's awareness for that, but we're by far not prepared for that moment in time. So much will have to be done. And I think that is, among other things, an argument to come together again in July.
Indeed, and there was that quote inserted into the council conclusions, talking about invites the council together with the commission to, quotes, take any appropriate measures to ensure closer energy coordination between member states. But that very specific call from Italy and Greece before the summit for an EU price cap on wholesale gas prices, there was quite a lot of pushback on that before the summit, but they seem to have got somewhere with it.
Well, they're pushing, and the closer you get to the moment in which you actually potentially will have a much stronger gas cut from the side of Russia, there's an increasing pressure to deal with the increasing gas prices, and they're increasing by the day. And if Russia progresses the way which has engaged, also has intensified over the past days and weeks, gas prices will even increase. So there's also an increasing pressure on those who are among the EU 27 who want to avoid gas caps, who want to keep the market liberated and not interfere as much into it as the Greeks and the Italians are proposing now for a while. This is not a new proposal. It has been on the table for the while. And my assumption is that it will come back with force if the member states will have to react to developments which are being determined by Moscow and by Vladimir Putin.
Just one more question before we move on to the Conference of the Future of Europe, and I bring in Corina. And by the way, if you have any questions, please don't forget, you can put them in the Q&A or raise your hand. But it was about the Euro Summit. And we now see a lot of fears that inflation could trigger recession. We see rising bond yields and so on, and it could trigger another Euro crisis. Did EU leaders, in light of this, did they discuss that potential risk? And if they did they take any concrete decisions, for example, on moving forward with the banking union, with capital markets union? Is there a new sense of urgency about this or not?
I think there is a sense of urgency, and the indications are increasing that not in 22, but in 23, we might witness negative economic developments, a worsening of the situation paired with inflation, which makes it also difficult to react at the national level, but also at the European level. So there is an increasing fear of the situation, also economic situation getting worse. Is there a fear that the Euro crisis will come back? I don't think that there is a strong fear. There's a danger that it could, but I don't think that there is, at this present point in time, a strong fear that it will. However, having said that, what we see in the conclusions, as you said, this was also a Euro summit, an inclusive format involving all member states. There is a reiteration that the countries of the Eurozone will be working on completing banking union, will work on progressing with respect to the capital markets union. But if you follow the discussions in the Eurogroup, if you follow the discussion which we've seen over the past years, actually we have gotten stuck in many ways when it comes to that decision. So if there's an increasing economic pressure, also the spread of sovereign bonds, which we're already seeing happening, that will also increase the pressure on working on banking union, capital markets union. It will actually deliver the results which we probably still need to complete EMU. I am very skeptical about that. But let's end with a positive note, which is that Croatia is set to join the euro area in the beginning of 23.
Absolutely.
That's good news coming out of the summit.
Absolutely. Very important. Thank you for reminding us of that. So, Corina, I wanted to come back to you on the Conference on the Future of Europe, which, of course, the EPC, along with others in the Conference Observatory, the Bertelsmann Stiftung and others, have been working assiduously on and following step by step. And we've had many discussions, really referring back to what you said about there's doubts about whether the EU is serious about enlargement or able to contemplate expansion if it wanted to. And I mentioned that Olaf Scholz talked about this. The Council conclusions refer to it. You would have thought that the Conference on the Future of Europe, with its recommendations for how the EU can move forward on these sort of things and bring the EU up to be modernized and capable of acting, there would be real appetite, real discussion on this. The Council conclusions, I'm just going to read them. It says almost nothing. They take note of the proposals. They say there'll be an effective follow-up to be ensured by the institutions. And then they say, and the only reference to citizens is, the importance of ensuring citizens are informed of the follow-up, not take up their ideas, simply informed. As I understand it, there was almost no discussion on this. Is this right? And why are these conclusions, do you think, so bland and so empty?
Yes, indeed, Jackie. EU leaders made only a cursory acknowledgement of the conference, of its outcome, and as you said, called for an effective follow-up by institutions according to the competencies on citizens' proposals. And to me, this suggests that perhaps the present reality feels too overwhelming as it is. So the prospect of adding further stress with discussions about major policy innovations and more effective governance structures, which would or could require treaty change, is not exactly appealing. It's a short-sighted and it's a misguided way of dealing with the unfolding Zeitenwende since the start of the war. The European Parliament has already responded to the conference by calling for a European Convention, and the Commission's own analysis of the conference proposals does not dismiss the possibility of treaty change. So far, though, there's little ambition that transpires from the Council, from the Member States, at the time when the EU really needs to prepare for the new era more and arguably better than ever before.
So, I mean, would it be fair to say that would you read into this that in terms of significant change, and we'll come back to what the Commission might do, how they might take this up in their work proposals, but in terms of significant change, it's a dead duck? Or is this just right now and they could come back to it? I mean, you, the high-level advisory group of the Conference Observatory that I mentioned earlier, has called for the establishment of what you've called, I rather like it, a wise woman group to reflect on where we might need treaty change and so on. Do you think that's just not going to be a starter, given the lack of interest now?
Yes, so the high-level advisory group of the Conference Observatory project, of which the EPC is part of, has recently called for this wise men group to be set up, which would include both experienced political heavyweights as well as representatives of younger generations, to basically help EU leaders agree on the list of urgent policy priorities and innovations, and to help them identify the ways in which they can improve the Union's governance structures and forge an ambitious reform roadmap. Of course, the discussion did not come even close to that. We think it could help to have such a group in place in order to give a momentum for the conversation and for important decisions. But ultimately, what truly matters is for EU leaders to realize that there is no time to waste, and this is not the right time to play it small. And I think, although there is quite sufficient pressure and quite a lot of imperatives and burning fires around, I think we still lack a real sense of urgency to kick us into action, and perhaps that's because we lack a vision for what we want to achieve and how the future should look like.
And I thought that's what the Conference on the Future of Europe was supposed to be all about, developing Indeed. That vision. Let me come to Janis. And Johannes Greubel points out 4 years ago, the European Council reacted to the European citizens' consultations with a similar statement. Back then, he says, it was the last time it dealt with the recommendations of the European citizens' consultations. Now, again, only a very brief acknowledgement of the Conference on the Future of Europe. Will that be it? Or can we expect anything else from member states on the follow-up? How do you read the lack of interest, the lack of discussion at this summit?
Actually, I do not know where to start. But let me start by linking it to the discussion we had earlier about Ukraine and Moldova and granting them candidate status, and talking about the absorption capacity of the European Union, talking about the ability of the EU to be able to add new members to the club. And that actually needs, it was the case in the past and it's the case now, and it will be the case in the future. It also requires the EU to reform itself. So this is a slap in the face of a decision which was taken the day before. No, the conclusion already came out yesterday on the conference. So it was on the same day. So on the same day, you were telling we're going to enlarge. We have understood that this is a geopolitical imperative. We live in a new world. We cannot ignore the realities on the ground. And then when it comes to reforming the European Union, you take note of the proposals of the conference which dealt with the future of Europe. So this is a slap in the face. It's also a slap in the face of the parliament, by the way, which had said and had come to the conclusion that you even need a convention. Now you can discuss as to whether you need a convention, whether you need treaty changes or not, but it is the European Parliament which has come to that conclusion, and then that's the response which you're giving to them. It's a slap in the face of all those who were engaged in the conference itself, including the 800 citizens who invested a lot of time, energy, and enthusiasm, and all those who dealt and worked on the conference. So I think it is a big mistake. It's the wrong message to send out. It is this general feeling, and I now come to the politics of it. There's no appetite. There's no appetite for treaty change. But what you're also telling us is there's no appetite for EU reforms, going back to what I was saying earlier. And we know the politics behind this. The French elections made it more difficult.
How important, some people say Emmanuel Macron was a great champion of this process, and his election woes, what happened in the parliamentary elections, is a big explainer that he will have lost interest in it, and that's why the rest of the EU feel they can now ignore it. Is that a fair analysis? Is that how you read it?
Well, I think that there are different, there's additional elements you need to add to that. Yes, the French elections, and I mean the presidential elections at that time, and now the legislative elections played a role and are playing a role, also because Macron's having a problem in setting and putting in place a government and how to deal with the election result of last Sunday. It is also that even before these elections, Macron got a signal from Berlin, this is not the right moment in time to think about reforming the European Union, doing treaty changes. And I think that this was the wrong signal also coming from Berlin, of a government, by the way, which in its coalition agreement was talking itself about the need for a convention, about reforming the European Union, and now backtracking to from what they had been saying. So there's a lot of politics in this. And by the way, also the way how this has been formulated, the council conclusions, it's as if you're trying to send out the signal as we told you so. Yeah, we and a big proportion of member states, governments, were not very supportive of the conference. And we told you so that we would not live up to the expectation which some might have. And that for me tells me that you have not understood. And I'm talking to those who are taking these decisions, that you have not understood what Zeitenwende means, what new era means, what watershed means. And I think that is the wrong signal at the wrong time.
You referred to the coalition agreement, but as I mentioned earlier, also Olaf Scholz speaking in the context of yesterday's decision about making ourselves capable of enlargement. So there doesn't seem to be.
Yeah, but that is undermining the credibility of himself and of the logic which he's portraying, because he linked Ukraine, Moldova to the need to also reform the European Union. So if you're not ready to engage yourself into a process about the debate on the future of Europe, then what signal are you giving?
I'm going to turn to the positive side of this, which is the Commission and what they're going to do with some of the proposals. But before I do, Stefan Schreck says, does the reaction of the Council not just reflect the fact that citizens' assemblies at EU levels would inevitably strengthen the supranational element of the EU, which is seen as changing the institutional balance by member state governments? So quickly, Janis, and then I want to come back to Corina on what the Commission is doing. Is that part of the equation, that this is giving more power to the EU's elbow and therefore being resisted on that grounds alone?
As you said, we have, Corina and colleagues and myself, and also you, have been following the conference very closely. And also in the discussions among citizens, their discussions was not about being pro-European integrationists. It was about concerns they were having in different areas and ideas they came up and things which they thought should change at the European level. And yes, if you look at these proposals and also the concrete measures, they point into the direction of more cooperation among the EU27, more integration. But that was not the starting point in these debates. This was the outcome of the discussions. So for those who do not want the EU to move in this direction, they're probably opposed to the ideas and proposals and recommendations coming out of the conference. But this is what these 800 citizens thought. And by the way, if there would have been other 800, not the same ones, other ones, I think the result would have been similar. So they're ignoring also the will of people, and it's not only the will of the 800.
Let me turn to a more positive side of this, which was the Commission's reaction. I say they had this detailed assessment of what was needed, and they've promised, Corina, to outline a first set of proposals in Ursula von der Leyen's State of the Union speech in the autumn for inclusion in the 2023 work programme. Are there any clues yet as to which bits they're going to pick up on? And also they've, I think, made some commitments on genuinely embedding participatory democracy in EU policy making in some of their work already. What are they actually concretely doing to pick up on some of these proposals, or what do we think they might do?
Right. I mean, before I answer that, I also wanted to weigh in on the member states' performance on this subject in the summit. And I would say that rather than putting this on the back of the tension between representative and participatory democracy, which clearly still has to be resolved, I would say that it also links not only to a lack of appetite for treaty change, but also to the fact that it is uncomfortable, it is difficult, it is challenging to actually think creatively about the future. It is difficult to brainstorm and come up with ideas that actually are constructive and provide solutions to the complex challenges that we face. It's not an exercise that just anybody can take on. And also, of course, there are all sorts of risks engaging with this exercise beyond treaty change. It can also end up circumventing the room of maneuver for member states in many other ways, and changing the nature of the European integration process. So generally speaking, discussions about the future are difficult to be had. Now, with regard to the Commission, already in the communication that the Commission issued vis-a-vis the results of the conference, there's reference, for example, to the goal of enriching democracy through citizens panels that would deliberate and make recommendations ahead of certain key proposals. Of course, the citizens panels, we assume, would be modeled somewhat on what we have seen already in the context of the conference. So they would be deliberative. Okay. And apparently the first generation of such panels will actually be launched in the context of the President's State of the Union address, as we say, in September. So that's as much indication as we have. For the rest, the Commission's analysis, I mean, goes through issues that through responses to the different proposals based on what the Commission is already doing, on what is really innovative and could be taken forward. And so we'll have to see in the end what from this will then really make it into the State of the Union.
Doesn't these look as if the Commission is taking up the baton where it can, we're not talking about treaty change? Dimitri Korpakis says, in times of acute crisis, it's rather normal to pay attention to the most critical short and medium-term problems and put EU reforms on the back burner. But isn't there, he suggests, a need to convene a thorough reflection on the concept of the ever-expanding union, i.e., he says, never-ending enlargement, or at least to consider the two concepts together? I mean, they are considering the two concepts together, as we've said, but I don't know the degree. I wasn't following it close enough to know whether there was much of a debate on an ever, as he puts it, an ever-expanding union at the conference, or whether indeed now there needs to be. Briefly, if you would, Corina, because then I would like to just ask you both one last question. Just a reaction to Dimitri on this.
Yes, I mean, of course, the moment demands a lot in terms of urgent responses, but sometimes the decisions we take today have implications for the future, and I think you cannot really divorce what we're doing today from what will happen next. And we have to, in parallel, invest on both tracks. Now, with regard to enlargement, I mean, the mere decision of granting candidate status and to these Eastern countries, and also conditionally to Georgia, means everything we've said, but it also means that the borders of the EU, geographically speaking, are being pushed further and further. So then, of course, it has such far-reaching implications, and it raises so many questions about what is the European Union? Where does it end? What does it stand for? What does it mean? What is it for? I mean, enlargement forces us to reevaluate a lot of the things, and this is why it's linked to the discussions about the future.
Indeed, I remember once having a conversation with someone about that. I was saying, should we define where the borders of the EU end? And they said politicians should never answer questions they don't need to answer tomorrow. It's not something we should discuss. Janis, a brief reaction to Dimitri before we draw some quick conclusions.
Well, there obviously, and we've been discussing about that, is a link between the issue of enlargement and the issue of internal EU reform. But there is also, and that's why it is a mistake to think of the current challenges, saying this is what we need to do immediately, deal with these things today and tomorrow, and in the longer term we'll see what we'll have to do when we get to there. That's wrong, and it's wrong also because we're seeing that the EU 27, even in such a Zeitment, a watershed moment, having increasing difficulties to find consensus. And the discussion we've had on the 6th sanction package show that, and that has also to do with the fact that there are major differences among member states, and there's also an increasing distrust of where you want to move, where you want to get to, what ultimately is the aim you want to achieve. So the longer term is having an effect on today's decision already. So if you try to avoid the longer term because you think, well, we have time, which is, by the way, a fallacy in itself, that you think you have time, because preparing for the longer term will take time, so you shouldn't lose time. So trying to avoid having the discussion about the future of Europe, which there is a link to the conference, but there's also a link to the new reality we live in, is at the end of the day also detrimental to today's situation. And that's where probably representative democracy, which is a huge value in itself, needs help. And that, I think that's why I still believe that having a group, we call it the Wise Women Group, who will be asked to think about what are concrete policy priorities and prioritize them, and what also are potential concrete treaty changes, not treaty change in plural in general, but specifically what are needed. So representative democracy probably needs help, and the citizens have tried to help. Now we need probably another mechanism to get them off the ground.
Very last question, I'm going to ask for 1-minute replies. I'm taking into account all the issues we've discussed and the bits that made hearts flutter, the bits that made us sigh with dismay. Charles Michel said in his invitation to EU leaders, we need at this summit to take further steps to strengthen our continent's security and stability. Corina, in 1 minute, overall, did they take those steps, and were they big enough?
Well, for me, the short answer is no. I mean, I don't feel that this summit particularly lived up to the labels of historic or geopolitical, to these aspirations, grand aspirations. I think we're far away from the ambitious vision that we need to brave this big and increasingly scary world we live in.
Thank you very much. Janis?
As so often with the EU, the answer is yes and no. Yes, because what the decisions they took, especially with respect to candidate status of Ukraine, Moldova, and eventually potentially also Georgia, was a step, was also significant, and it was necessary. But it was just one step. And there's a lot of things that need to be done in order to live up to the step which they have taken yesterday. So this is only the start of a very difficult road. And unfortunately, some signs coming out of this this summit point in a different direction. So there's a discrepancy between the good things which we saw yesterday and today, and what still needs to be done.
And on that note, thank you very much to both of you. That is all we have time for. Just a few EPC activities to flag up for you. We've already mentioned that event on Monday on looking at Emmanuel Macron and Charles Michel's ideas for creating the European geopolitical community. There will also be a commentary on that topic. Also events next week on Tuesday on the health response to the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. On Wednesday on Europe's Zeitenwende and the future of European integration. We're coming back on that issue. And on Thursday on stopping the Russian war machine, prospects for EU and US energy sanctions. And Janis and I and Fabian will be back next month. We did have a date for it. We'll have to now wait and see, because if there's another summit, it will not just be an EPC update as we close before the summer break, but it may also be a post-summit briefing. So watch this space. We'll get back to you. But Janis, thank you very much. As always, Corina, great to have you with us. Thank you to all of you for joining us. And it only remains for me to wish you a very pleasant weekend. Take care and goodbye.
Likewise. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.